hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello. Welcome to another SQL Night. Okay, in Greece it's not night yet. I'm Athens Chatzipavlis, and today I'm going to be the moderator of this session. Also, I'm the founder of SQLschool.gr. The SQLschool.gr is a community for professionals who use Microsoft Data Platform. And in this site, in this community, you will find articles, webinar videos, resources, and news about Microsoft Data Platform. You can join us as a member or follow us in social media to keep up with our community. The SQLschool.gr it is 11 years old, and I would like to thank you all for your participation and support. Today, we have the privilege to have Peter Meyers as presenter. I'm not going to talk about Peter. Peter is one of the biggest influencers of Power BI, and always is a pleasure to have Peter as a presenter in our community. For a couple of years, we have Peter to present us some interesting topics. I'm going to leave Peter to introduce himself. Also, I would like to tell you that during presentation, please mute your mics, but do not hesitate to open your mics if you want to ask something. But I would like, before doing this, to raise your hand. Also, if you would like to ask something, you are able to write it in the chat, and I'm going to transfer this question to our presenter. So, Peter, you can share your screen and you can start your presentation. First of all, I would like to thank you once more for your participation in our community.
Well, welcome. Thank you. So let's just do a sound check. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, of course.
Awesome. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, of course.
Okay, well, let me make a start. I'm thinking, Antonios, that I'm presenting for what, 60 minutes?
It's your time. 60 minutes, 1 hour and a half. Take your time and
okay. Let me aim for 60 minutes. Okay. So let me begin. So I am welcome you to this user group presentation on demystifying Power BI datasets. So I have some questions. Are you confused and confounded by the features and capabilities and frameworks or the terms used by Power BI? Because Power BI has now been a service for what, 5-6 years, and it has undergone enormous change and growth. And so in my experience, and together with Chris Webb, we produced this presentation, but it's Saturday and Chris is on his weekend, so he's not joining me. But we discovered that many customers and students of mine are very confused. There are so many terms related to data sets. So we put together this presentation of more than 50 different terms to help you gain a deeper understanding of Power BI data sets. We think it is valuable for both beginners and for advanced practitioners. And we hope that you'll learn something unexpected. Very brief introduction of myself. So Peter Meyers from Melbourne, Australia. 14 years MVP, specializing in Microsoft Data Platform with a focus on business intelligence. And of course, Power BI would be my #1 topic today with my customers and in training. Sometimes I do a survey, but today I think I will leave the survey out, and I think I will just make a start on the agenda. So for those that are new to Power BI, the fundamentals will be very important. For those that have experience in Power BI, the first topics might be very simple for you, but just keep watching as I progress into more difficult topics. So starting with fundamentals, I'm going to work through the definition of what a data set is. So the simplest definition is that it is a source of data for your reports. And basically, Power BI means nothing without data sets because the service is a data visualization service. So understand that it is the most important artifact, and perhaps for that reason, the most complex artifact as well. So let's be very clear through an example that here in workspace A, there is a single data set, but 2 reports and 1 dashboard. And also we see workspace B has 2 reports and a data set, but we can connect report B1 to data set A1. Okay, so data sets can be accessed across the workspaces. Providing you have permission, you can access any data set within your tenant that you need. And they are sources of data for reports and dashboards. Now, paginated report bear, maybe you have found this bear. He is the unofficial mascot of paginated reports, and he reminds us that, wait a minute, dataset is a term already used by paginated reports, and yes, paginated report bear is correct, but in this instance, a dataset is a very different concept. In a paginated report or a SQL Server reporting services report, the dataset is a command to retrieve data, like a select statement or a store procedure. Okay, in Power BI, the dataset's very different. And to make things a little more confusing, in a paginated report, when you create a data source, you can connect to a Power BI data set. And then in your paginated report, you can create a data set off that data set, okay? I'm not going to talk any more about paginated reports and data sets, but to be clear, we are not talking about data sets in paginated reports. So the conversation continues. And another key term that you need to be familiar with is data model. And its definition is that it is a queryable data source optimized for analytics. So Microsoft models can be queried with one of 2 languages, either DAX or MDX. And sometimes you might hear these models described as semantic model or simply the word model. Now that brings us to the type of query that a model works with. And the query is what we call an analytic query. It produces a result from a data model, but it has 3 distinct phases of filter, group, and summarize. In fact, every visual on a Power BI report is concerned with filter, maybe grouping, but almost certainly summarizing your data. Let me explain. So here's an example of some data. This is the company's sales orders, of which there are thousands and thousands of them. And yet I have a simple question. And that question is, what were the quarterly sales in 2021? Now, to answer that question, the data needs to be filtered to the year 2021, grouped by the 4 quarters, and then the sum of sales for each quarter needs to be summarized. All right, so the analytic query condenses this mass of raw data into a result that's easy for a human to understand. So how can we do that in Power BI? Well, one way is to filter the report page by 2021. We could then use a column chart visual with groupings of the quarters on the horizontal axis. And then the summarization is achieved through a measure or summing a column within the groups. Okay, so everything you do in a Power BI report is following this exact process: filter, group, and summarize. Now, it brings us to the next definition of tabular model, because Microsoft have 2 different modeling technologies, of which the newer, and certainly the technology that Power BI uses, is the tabular model. And so its foundation is that it really is a set of tables comprising columns, and yet you can also enrich your model with relationships and hierarchy levels and calculations. So to be clear, in Power BI, all models are tabular. So let's understand that we can develop these in Power BI Desktop because it's a data modeling tool, but Power BI Desktop is also a report authoring tool, okay? But we're not here to talk about reporting today. But because it is a tabular model, we're going to use a technology of Power Query to connect to data stores and to transform that data into table data. All right, so we do this with Power Query queries, and we can apply an extraordinary number of transformations to produce these tables. When those queries are applied, they become tables in your model. Now, also, these tables could be defined through calculations, all right? But either way, using DAX to create a calculated table or Power Query to connect and transform data is where the tables come from. And of course, those tables deliver columns, and those columns can also be calculated columns with DAX. And where you have more than one table in the model, you're going to have relationships that propagate filters from tables to tables. Remember the analytic query? Filter, group, summarize. Okay, so filtering is important, and filters need to propagate between the tables. More on that in a moment. Now, your tabular model is more than just tables and columns. To support improved usability of the model, we can add hierarchies, and hierarchies have levels, and those levels are simply columns, supporting navigation perhaps from year to quarter to month, or country to state to city. And then there's one last piece that gives us the foundations of the model, and it is the measure. Again, a DAX expression that is to summarize the data in your model. Okay, so there we have it, the basics of the tabular model. And if you're going to be working with Power BI, you must become very familiar with all of these objects and how to build them together and optimize them to produce, a very friendly and fast query experience. All right, so it's the basics of a tabular model. Now, the next definition that Chris and I thought was very important for Power BI people to understand is the definition of star schema. Now, star schema comes from relational data warehousing, and it is a design technique where tables are classified either as dimension or fact. Now, this applies to data warehouses, but it equally applies to well-designed, optimal tabular models. So a little bit of theory. It's called star schema because those dimension tables form the point of a star, and the fact table is at the center. And that fact table represents the accumulation of your business activity and events, and your dimension tables are your things, your people, places, products, and concepts. All right. Now, what's interesting with an analytic query is your filtering and grouping happens on dimension tables, and the summarization happens against the fact tables. All right, so having an understanding of star schema is very important to building good data models. So in addition to dimension and fact tables, we strongly recommend that you become familiar with terminologies like granularity of data, dimensionality of data, surrogate key and measure, and there are more. And so I include a link here. And by the way, this presentation will be available to download as a PDF document at the end of the presentation. The article is one that I wrote for Microsoft as part of their guidance documentation, because it was making very clear to people the importance of star schema, and also if they have experience in relational data warehousing, then you can learn very quickly how to produce good Power BI models. Okay, so star schema, highly recommend that you become familiar with it. The next term related to a data set is the term field. And a field is really just a report authoring concept, really. It's not a modeling concept. We don't have a field as an object of the model, but you're probably familiar with the fields pane in Power BI Desktop. Now, this is the report authoring experience. And so what you'll find is that columns and levels of hierarchies and also measures are fields. So fields is a very broad term. It's a collective term for these types of model resources that you can then use to configure your visuals in a Power BI report. Well, that covers the fundamentals except for one last one, and it's the definition of another artifact in Power BI known as the data flow. And there's a lot of confusion about data flows and data sets, like aren't they the same thing? They store data. They both do store data, but the data flow is a fragment of data and it cannot be queried directly by a Power BI report. All right, so let's use an example here that in my Power BI workspace, I have two artifacts, a data flow and a report. The fact is, people think that you can query a data flow from a report, but they're wrong. Instead, you're going to need to use Power BI Desktop to then import data from the data flow and probably other data sources too, to create that beautiful star schema model. When you've finished developing the model, you'll publish the Power BI Desktop solution, resulting in the creation of a data set. Now, that data flow can be used to periodically refresh the data in the data set. And then, of course, the report can query that data set. Okay, so that's the correct relationship between these artifacts. The next group of definitions are about hosting. Okay, so we can talk about data models as either hosted internally in Power BI. Now that means literally, if you have the data set in Power BI, then the model is also inside the compute of Power BI. If you develop a model in Power BI Desktop and you publish it to Power BI, then it is an internal model. But let's be clear that there is the possibility for external hosted models. And this arises when you're using either Azure Analysis Services or you're using SQL Server Analysis Services on premises. Do note that SQL Server Analysis Services also supports Power BI querying the older type of model, which is the multi-dimensional model, often referred to as a cube. All right. Now, for external hosted models, we introduce another terminology that it is a live connection. So let's talk about this first. In an example here in the Power BI service, I have dataset A, and it connects to an Azure Analysis Services model. That's one scenario. And a second scenario is that dataset B connects to a SQL Server Analysis Services model. And you need to recognize that this requires an installation of the on-premises gateway. And that gateway would support the secure communication between Power BI and the on-premises machines. And we'll be talking about gateways later. So let's move to the next definition of what is a live connection. So it can be one of two things. It can be a report connecting to a data set, or that it's a data set, as I've just explained, connecting to an external hosted model. So let's see by example. Here in Power BI, from a report authoring perspective, I have a data set, and to create a report, I can create a live connection to the data set, and then I can generate some visuals of data. And then when I'm ready, I publish, and then the report is now in the workspace. So Power BI Desktop uses the concept of a live connection to query a data set in Power BI. Now, there's a second time that we use live connection, and that is the data set. Connecting to Azure Analysis Services, when a report uses that data set, the queries actually query Azure Analysis Services. So the data set is really just a redirection to the actual true data source that is external from Power BI. Next group of definitions, real-time analytics, one of my favorite topics, the ability to deliver real-time responses in Power BI reports and dashboards. And so here you can see an example of what a Power BI report might look like with real-time updates in the visuals. Now, how is this done? Well, there are special types of data sets that are there for real-time presentation of data. The streaming data set is very specific. In fact, the streaming data set cannot be used by Power BI reports. It is used only by dashboard streaming tiles. This type of data set caches data for up to 60 minutes, and it provides a very fluid, very fast real-time experience in the dashboard. Now, a second type of data set is known as the push data set. And this is different because it is very similar to a tabular model. It has tables and columns, relationships, even calculations, but you cannot create them in Power BI Desktop. You create them either in the Power BI service, that is the web interface, or as a developer, you programmatically create the push data set using the Power BI REST API. Now, to load data into the model, it has to be programmatically pushed. But when rows of data are pushed into the tables of the model, then Power BI will reflect real-time updates in dashboard tiles. Now, there's the hybrid data set, which is actually the streaming and push at the same time. So if you create a hybrid data set, there are really two data sets in Power BI, a real-time streaming data set and a push data set. All right, so when you look at the dataset hub in Power BI service and you look at the list of data sets, you don't really know what type of data sets they are. For example, the per capita sales here, I would have to tell you, I published it, it is an internal model, yet the finance cube is an external hosted model connecting to SQL Server analysis services, and it's multidimensional. The call center operations is a push data set, the FX or foreign exchange rates is a streaming data set, and then device telemetry is hybrid. It is both push and streaming. So those last three are very special cases for real-time data sets. Probably the majority of data sets that you will create, if you are a self-service business analyst, is the internal hosted model with Power BI Desktop. The external hosted models are more when you have enterprise larger models that are developed by the IT group and BI developers. One last definition for real-time data sets is the automatic page refresh. So this is a report design capability in Power BI that allows the report to automatically refresh on schedule. Now, it requires a certain type of model. It is a direct query model, and we'll talk about direct query next. But if you have a direct query model and the data is updating quickly, then you can enable automatic page refresh to have the Power BI reports deliver real-time updates. Now, I could talk about real-time Power BI for much longer, but no time today. What I will share with you here, and the link will be available for you in the PDF, is that Miguel Martinez and myself recorded a 1-hour webinar. We talk about everything real time and we provide lots of demonstrations. So if you're interested, you'll just come back, use this link, and you can register to watch that webinar. All right, so let's move into perhaps the most interesting and complex topics and definitions for data sets, and that is model frameworks. All right, so the first definition we need to give you is that there is a property known as the table storage mode. It applies only to tables that are coming from Power Query, so not calculated tables. The storage mode provides three options. There's import, direct query, and dual, and we'll be talking about dual storage mode later. But for now, we'll talk about import and direct query. In short, import says that the table loads data, and direct query says the data stays in the data source. All right, so this is what it looks like when you edit the properties: import, direct query, and dual. And so it brings us to the most common type of tabular model, and it is the import model. And what it means is that every table in that model is using import storage mode, which is the default in Power BI Desktop, and it is the most common configuration for reasons I'll describe very shortly. So let's see by example. Here is the model, and watch here as we're importing more and more data from different sources, and the model and that star screamer grows larger and larger. Right, well, how do we create these? Well, in Power BI Desktop, you get data and you connect to a data source type. And for many data source types, you will see the option to also choose the data connectivity mode, import or direct query. Now, the default will always be import, and for good reason, because there are many benefits for using import storage. Because every data source type supports import, And you can import from multiple sources, and this enables data integration within your model. There is practically no restriction to the DAX functions or Power Query functions that you can use, and you can create calculated tables. And almost always, these import models deliver the best query performance because the data has been preloaded, it has been compressed and optimized, it is cached in memory, and this is the fastest experience for these analytic queries that are filtering and grouping and summarizing. But wherever there are benefits, there are also limitations. And because data is being imported, these models, they might begin as small, but over time they might grow to become larger and larger. And Power BI will impose restrictions. For example, 1 gigabyte is the maximum size in a non-premium workspace. So size will become an issue. If you have large sets of data or lots of history, it may become difficult to import that data. And the other consideration is that because it's an import of data, that data can become old and stale. So therefore, your data model requires periodic refresh, maybe once a day or many times a day, to keep that data fresh. Now, one problem with that is, especially for large models, is that by refreshing the model, it has to reload everything, okay? And for large models, that could be very expensive and very time consuming, and it could also put a big workload on the data sources that store the data, okay? So the import model is fantastic, except when you start to grow in size with the volume of data. And that is where direct query can solve a problem for you. So the definition of a direct query model is that every table in the model is using direct query storage mode for the same data source. By example. So here we have a model, and it queries a SQL database. So notice here that when a Power BI report uses this data set, those queries are sent directly down to the database. Okay, so if you're going to create a direct query model, you must intentionally select the direct query connectivity mode. And the benefits are large, right? You can use Power BI reports over terabytes of data. It never requires data refresh. It can deliver real-time results for you, and due to a recent preview capability, there's a very exciting concept where you can personalize or extend a data set to create a new version of a data set. I'll talk about this one shortly. But again, when there are benefits, there are also limitations. And not all data sources support direct query mode. For the purposes of data modeling, only relational databases, typically relational databases like SQL, Oracle, Teradata. The Power Query queries cannot be overly complex because the transformations must translate to the native query of your data source. Depending on the type of queries or the database or the optimizations that may or may not be in your database, this could result in very slow responses. Okay, so just be careful. And it could also put an added workload on your data sources. And so for that reason, I would suggest if you're going to create a direct query model, you should have a good conversation with your database owner so they understand what you're doing. Maybe they support you, they optimize the queries, or they provide additional resources that the database can continue to do what it was designed to do, in addition to handling the Power BI workload. Okay, so direct query is very interesting for very specific cases, typically two cases: large volume or the need for real-time results to come to Power BI. Remember the automatic page refresh. Automatic page refresh only works on direct query tables. All right, next definition is the source group. So in prior documentation and in some books, you might hear of this being called data island. It has been relabeled by Microsoft to become source group, but it's a very important concept in the model because it opens up the potential to do many more interesting things than just import or direct query. It allows us to bring them together in one model. So there are two types of source group. The first one is known as the import source group. Your model either has one or none. Okay, if you are importing data or creating calculated tables, they will be stored inside the import source group. Yet, if you have direct query data sources, then there will be one source group for each data source. Okay, so let's take a look at this example here. So this was an import model, but I'm going to add an additional source to connect to a direct query database. So now the model has two source groups. It has an import source group for all the imported data, and it has a direct query source group. So we have a new term for you, and that is composite model. All right. A model that has more than one source group is called a composite model. Let's take a look at an example here of a model diagram. And the new model diagram view gives us much more information, including source group information. So if I hover the cursor over the date table, I learn that it's import. In fact, if the table does not have a color bar across the top, then it's an import table. But you'll notice that three tables have a blue bar across the top. And by hovering the cursor, we see the storage mode is direct query, and we see details about the database connection. All right, so that's the concept of composite modeling. The next definition is Power BI desktop mode. What you might notice in Power BI desktop is at the bottom right corner, you might sometimes see some text here. There are four possibilities. The first is that you might see that you have a live connection. Remember, live connection is connecting to a data set in the Power BI service. So this could be any model framework. It could be import, it could be direct query, it could be composite, and there could be one or more source groups. If you see nothing in the bottom right corner, Power BI Desktop is telling you that you are in an import model. All tables are imported, therefore there's just the one source group. If you see direct query, then you either have direct query or composite, but they are all direct query storage modes. Therefore, there could be one direct query source or there could be multiple direct query sources, but there is no import source group. And lastly, mixed says you're definitely in composite modeling. You have an import source group and you have a direct query source group and possibly more direct query source groups. Okay, so Power BI Desktop mode is sort of an interesting concept because it doesn't really map to the model frameworks that we have. All right, so looking at this example again, if I was just to revise what I've covered, by looking at the diagram, the desktop mode is clearly mixed because I have two import tables and three direct query source tables, right? The model framework is composite because we have direct query and import, or we have more than one source group. There are two source groups. And then the question about how many data sources I have, in fact, you cannot answer that question looking at the model diagram. The reason you cannot answer the question is because the import source groups, you don't know that the Power Query could be connecting to multiple different sources. All right, so the model diagram will not tell us how many data sources, but I will tell you, because this is a real example from one of my customers, there is one data source in this model. And you might say, but hold on a minute, why are we importing from a data source, but also using direct query to the same data source? And the answer is very interesting. It's because this is financial transactions. And the actual transactions are imported every day, once a day. But for this company, they also do forecasting and budgeting. And what they want to do is what we call write back. They want to update the numbers, write them back to the database, and then they want to look at the Power BI report and compare actuals to forecast and maybe make some adjustments. So the scenarios of budget and forecast are in direct query to provide real-time reporting over those scenarios. So in the one model, one database, one data source, but using a balanced architecture to give us real-time responses for forecast and budget. The next definition is local model. So it is either a model that's been developed or queried, or it's a relative term used to describe a model with a direct query connection to a Power BI dataset. Let me explain that one in a minute. A remote model, therefore, is a relative term to describe a model with a direct query connection to a Power BI dataset that is upstream. Let me give you an example. This is a very new and preview capability from Power BI. All right, so what we have in the Power BI service is a core model. This is a model representing the analytic source of truth. And in this case, it's a direct query model connecting to Azure Synapse Analytics Data Warehouse. Now, the business analyst opens up Power BI Desktop and creates a live connection to this data set. Now, that's nothing new. The reason we use live connection in Power BI Desktop is to create a report of a data set. But what is new is that we can edit the model. And what that will do is convert the live connection into a direct query model that queries the data set. All right. Now that opens up new possibilities. The business analyst could personalize the model. I don't like the name of this table. I want to rename the table. I want to rename the columns. I want to hide the columns. I want to format the numbers differently. But much more interesting is this situation where we could import additional data into this new model. Okay, so I'm importing some data from a web page to bring in some population values. And look at this, I can create a relationship across the tables. So in this model now, with this local model in Power BI Desktop, I have a direct query source group to the Power BI dataset, and I have an import source group, and I'm also creating a relationship between them. Now, when I publish this back to the Power BI service, it creates a new data set, what I'll call a specialized data set. And so now when users query the data set through a report, it then queries the remote model, which is the core model. All right, so this is the new capability of direct query connections to Power BI data sets. So then it introduces another term, which is chaining. When you have multiple data sets querying one another, it's called chaining. All right, and Microsoft limit you to chain to no more than 3. All right, so consider this. Dataset C is chained to dataset B, and dataset B is chained to dataset A. What would happen if we created report B? Well, the truth is dataset C has nothing to do with this. But for report B, dataset B is local and dataset A is remote. If we have report C, and report C is querying dataset C, then dataset C is local for report. And then datasets A and B are both remote. That is the concept of the frameworks and import and direct query. There's more about frameworks, and we talk about them now in optimization of your models. So in optimization, the first topic I'll talk about is partition. All right, it is the refreshable object where the table's data is stored. This applies really only to import tables. Direct query tables do not have this concept of partition. All right, so what it means in the diagram here then is that tables in your model have partitions. Now, every table, at least every import table, has one partition. But what you can do And this doesn't apply to calculated tables, by the way. But what you can do is you can create multiple partitions on a table. So here is SQL Server Management Studio, which is being used to connect to the Power BI dataset. That tells me that it's a premium workspace because you can only do this with the XMLA read-write endpoint for premium. But using SQL Server Management Studio to connect allows us to then manage partitions, whereupon, you can see here that there are 3 partitions for this table, 2021, 2022, 2023. And therefore, we can refresh not the entire table, but we can refresh single partitions. And therefore, to improve the refresh performance, if you use partitioning, you will then refresh the partitions that have changed, probably the most recent partition in time. If you have a look at the Power Query behind the partition, you will see a filter like this. This is where it limits all of the orders just for those that took place in the year 2021. Okay, so partitioning is very useful for large import tables where the history never changes, and therefore you partition by time, and then you can speed up the refreshing of the model by just refreshing the most up-to-date partitions. Now that leads to another definition of hybrid table, and this was an announcement made at the Microsoft Business Applications Summit a couple of months ago now. But this is just getting unbelievably good, because not only in a model can we mix import and direct query, but now within partitions themselves, you can mix import and direct query at partition level. That means the table storage mode now becomes partition storage mode. So consider this. You could use import for all of your old history and archive data, and you could use direct query for the most current time period. And therefore, your reports will deliver up-to-date data at all times. So hybrid tables is new. It's not available yet, even in preview, but the announcement has been made. So stay tuned to learn about the preview delivery of this capability. This is a big thing for enterprise large models that need to be kept current. And once a day isn't good enough. All right, so hybrid tables. Now, I mentioned earlier that table storage mode is import direct query, or there is a third option, which is dual. And dual means that the table is both import and direct query, and it's up to Power BI to determine the most efficient query plan, and maybe it will use import, maybe it will use direct query. So let's revisit this data model, and there are some changes this time. And I want you to notice that there are 3 tables that have a striped blue line: a date table, scenario table, and account. Notably, they are all dimension tables. This is where the filtering and grouping will happen. Now, these are dual storage mode, as we can see here. They are both import and direct query. So what is our Power BI desktop mode? It's still mixed, it's still composite, there's still 2 source groups, and there's still 1 data source. So nothing has changed except 3 of the tables, the dimension tables, are importing and their direct query. Well, let's consider some examples. What if I created a report visual that filtered by date, groups by account, and summarizes from the journal table the actual amounts? Now, in this instance, because only the date, account, and journal tables need to be queried, Power BI does not need to use direct query. All right, the date and account tables are dual, so they're already imported, and the journal table is imported. So this entire visual could be satisfied very quickly from the cache data in the model. Now, this next visual, which is current expenses for forecast scenario. Well, the current year says we're filtering by date, we're filtering by scenario. They are both dual, but the summarization is happening on a direct query table. So in this instance, all of the dual and direct query tables are used to query the direct query source. No import data would be used to query for this visual. There is a high likelihood that Power BI could construct a single select statement to retrieve the query result for this visual. Let's consider a third scenario. What if we're going to use both fact tables in the same query? The journal table is import and the scenario amount is direct query. So in this instance, all tables are used and Power BI will use both direct query and import, and it will have to use the formula engine to combine the result to give it back to Power BI, okay? But it will do it. So dual storage mode is an optimization allowing Power BI to determine what is the most efficient way to query the data. Sometimes direct query, sometimes import. The next definition is an aggregation, which is a special type of table that is there to accelerate query performance over direct query tables. Okay, so it only works when you have a direct query table. And what it allows you to do is add aggregations and then configure the aggregations so that Power BI knows what the aggregation represents. Therefore, when it needs to, it can use the aggregation instead of going to the direct query source. Let's see an example. So in this different model, an aggregation table has already been added. It's just an import table. And I want you to notice that the two columns in the aggregation table are order date key and sales amount aggregated. So basically there is one row per date with the total sales. Now, in Power BI Desktop, we can manage aggregations and we can configure that table by telling the model that order date key represents a grouping of date key on the date table, and the sales amount aggregated represents the sum of the sales amount column from internet sales. Now, when you configure aggregations, the table is hidden, right? So be aware that table cannot be queried directly and DAX expressions cannot use it. But in the case where we have a visual here showing sales by color for current year, Power BI must query the product table, which is in direct query, to do this because the grouping is by color. So the aggregation cannot be used here because aggregation doesn't include color. But a second visual that is for the current year, what is sales by month? Well, answer that by using the dual date table and the aggregation. So it can use the import tables in the model to answer this very, very quickly without having to go to the direct query source. So aggregations are there to improve query performance over direct query tables. There's also the definition of query caching. So this is a feature for Power BI Premium or Power BI Embedded. And so the service can cache query results and reuse them. You can turn it on, and therefore, if there's a lot of repetition in the query patterns, it could speed up the reporting. There's also scheduled cache refresh. Now, this is where you're using Power BI dashboards, and dashboards use tiles and they use a very different architecture to reports. Those tiles are pre-cached results. Okay, now the problem with pre-caching the dashboard tiles is what happens when they are dependent on direct query or live connections to external hosted models, is that cache doesn't know when the data is changing. If it's an import table or an import model, the dashboard caches update when the refresh is complete, right? So it's easily understood. Power BI knows when the data changes, but for direct query and for live connections to external models, it doesn't know. So there's a property on the data set that tells the data set how frequently it should update the dashboard caches for direct query and live connections. Okay, so this is only relevant for Power BI dashboards when working with direct query and live connection. I think the default is 15 minutes. So that's the topic for optimizations. moving on to talk about refresh of data sets. So of course, this applies to import or dual storage tables only. And refresh is the process of bringing in and updating the partitions or the tables with new data. It can be scheduled or it can be done on demand. It can also be triggered through the Power BI service using the programmatically with REST API or using the XMLA read-write endpoint. Now, there's a feature in Power BI called incremental refresh. So this helps you with large import models so that you don't have to reload all the data. And internally, Power BI creates and manages table partitions for you automatically to support incremental refresh. And that way, it only has to refresh the partitions where it knows the data has changed. Next definition is gateway. That if you have data sources that reside on premises, Power BI being a cloud service needs to communicate with them for data refresh or for direct query and live connections. All right, there are two gateways, the standard and the personal. And in Power BI, the standard is known as the on-premises data gateway. All right, so this would be required for direct query and live connections. So what this means is that when Power BI needs to connect to on-premises sources for refreshing data, it uses the gateway. And the second reason it uses the gateway is for live connections and direct query to on-premises sources, which is used at report querying time. Okay, so gateways are used for refresh of import data or for reporting over direct query or live connections to on-premises. If you're using the standard gateway, you need to create gateway data sources. You need to predefine all of the sources that the gateway can use and store the credentials that Power BI would use to connect to those sources. And that concludes the refresh topic. The next set of terms are related to security. Okay, so every data set in your Power BI workspace has a single data set owner. And that dataset owner can control the configurations of the dataset. And if a different person or a different user needs to change the dataset, maybe they need to change the refresh frequency of the dataset, they will need to take ownership of the dataset. And then they can control the dataset and make configurations. Be aware that if you take ownership of a dataset and there are stored credentials like usernames, and passwords stored for that data set, you'll have to re-enter them. Right, data set permissions. All right, so there are 3 different permissions that can be applied to a data set. They include read permission, build permission, and reshare permission. What read means is that you can query the data in a data set. So if you have permission to look at a report, you must also have permission to read the data set. Okay. Build is the permission to allow you to create a report on a data set and also to do things like export detailed data from the data set or use analyze in Excel, whereby Excel can connect to the data set and you can use Excel pivot tables to query the data set. Okay, so build permission is required for creating reports and advanced features. Resharing is permission to share that data set to other people. Now, these permissions are not usually assigned directly to the data set. While it is possible, usually the way you get permission to a data set is either because you are a member or you belong to a workspace. You're either an admin, a member, or a contributor, and then automatically you inherit permissions to read and build on the data set. If you're a viewer role of a workspace, then you have read permission only. The other way that you might inherit permission to a data set is that you have the permission to get an app. And because you can get the app, you automatically get read permission to the data sets, and possibly build permission if the app owner had delegated build permission to the app users as well. All right, so that brings us to workspace role, of which there are 4: admin, member, contributor, and viewer. All of these grant privileges on the data sets in that workspace. The difference being that viewer is read permission only, but admin, member, and contributor is build and read. Gateway permissions. There is a gateway admin. So the admin needs permissions to be able to work with the gateway. And the next topic is data permissions. So this is also commonly referred to as row-level security. And that is the ability in a tabular model to add roles. And these roles define rules, being DAX filters. And these DAX filters allow you to limit data to different users. All right, so this way you could have a single model, but all of the report users see different data because of the row-level security being enforced. There are 2 types of rules to talk about. A static rule is one that is fixed, like this. Country region is Australia. Anybody that belongs to this role will only see Australian sales. All right, but this one here is a second role for UK. Anyone that belongs to the salespeople UK, they will get United Kingdom. Now, a dynamic role is different because it uses either the username or the user principal name functions. As you can see here, this salesperson role is filtering the salesperson table, and they're filtering the email column by the username. Now, assuming that in the email column, you have the user principal names, or like the email address of all of the salespeople, then the username function will return the username of the current authenticated Power BI user. So with a single role here, you've got dynamic filtering based on the name of the user. Okay, so that's what we call a dynamic rule. The last definition to talk about for security is object permissions. It is possible to secure tables or columns so that certain users can never see them. All right, only supported by Power BI Premium and analysis services in Azure and SQL Server. But what this means is that you can literally hide columns and tables of sensitive data. The only problem in Power BI, though, is if you share a report and the user cannot see the table, then the visuals will return errors because Power BI thinks the tables don't exist. Okay, but this is what we call object level permissions, different from row level security. All right, next topic, and we're almost done, but governance. It's very, very important to enforce good government standards. You need to know how things are being used and are they being used appropriately. There are a massive number of metrics about your data sets that are being captured, like memory usage, query times, numbers, counts, durations. All right, so usage metrics can be queried across your data sets. Endorsement is a topic about how you can promote and increase visibility and trust of your data sets. There are 2 types of endorsement, promoted and certified. So a promoted data set is done by the owner of the data set, and it is a way of telling people that this data set is suitable for use and for sharing. And so you might see this endorsement here. The per capita sales data set is promoted. The certified endorsement says that an authorized reviewer, not necessarily the dataset owner, is telling people that it meets the highest standards and quality in the organization and it is fit for reporting. So we can see here that the finance cube has been certified. Next topic is data lineage. So in Power BI, it is a view that shows relationships between other artifacts like data flows, data sets, reports, and dashboards. So therefore, if we look at the data lineage, we're able to see here that US sale analysis is actually using a web page and a connection to another data set. And also we can see downstream what reports are using it, what dashboards are using it. And this can be very important if you need to manage change. You might have good reason to change something, but you want to know the impact. Am I going to break something? Should I contact the report owners to let them know that they'll need to test their reports again? Okay, data lineage can help you with that. Sensitivity label comes next. So Microsoft now allow enforcing sensitivity labels like top secret. And Power BI will honor these. Therefore, top secret data may not be exported, for example. So Microsoft can allow you to control how data is made available and also used from Azure all the way through to Office by enforcing sensitivity labels. Data catalog is the concept of storing your data assets in a way that they can become discoverable and that people can learn about them and also know who to contact if they need help. So Microsoft are using in preview Azure Purview. They're creating a new holistic, up-to-date data catalog, and Power BI datasets are a first-class object. They can be cataloged and they can be easily discovered and accessed within the catalog itself. That concludes governance. The next topic is natural language. So this ability for Power BI to allow users to ask questions and for Power BI to respond using Q&A with data visualization responses. All right, so we could see an example here that we could use a proposed question. We could enter our own question. We could have suggestions given to us. We can interact with these visuals. We can modify and revise the question. Okay, this is Q&A. All right, it's available only in English and I think Spanish in preview. But that brings us to another term, is that because people often refer to the same thing by different names, sometimes we call it customer, sometimes we call it client. In the model, you can define synonyms for tables, columns, hierarchies, levels, or measures so that Q&A can find them. There's also linguistic schema that you can define complex phrases and other synonyms, like expensive products might be something that someone asked for. You could define in the linguistic schema that expensive product is where the product is more than $200. All right, so you can enrich the model even further beyond synonyms with linguistic schema. That brings us just to a final few definitions related to data sets. So a parameter, that in Power Query and Power BI Desktop, you can parameterize your queries. And this allows you, after you publish the model to Power BI service, is that in many circumstances, you can change the parameter values without republishing the model. So parameterizing connection strings or values that you know might change between test or development or production environments can be much more easily managed with parameters. Large data set isn't just a big data set, it's actually a data set setting that when enabled, the data set size is limited by the premium capacity size or the maximum size set by the administrator. So it is a premium capability for optimal storage of large import data sets. And the very last term, ladies and gentlemen, is that did you know that you can assign an image to your data set? So if you go to your data set settings, you can upload a file and then you can have the image that you like. And therefore, when you see it in the Datasets hub, or if you're in Teams, then your data set might be easily identified by using some specific artistic image, like this one here. Alrighty, well, that comes to a conclusion. Antonios, I'll have to ask, are there any questions that maybe anybody's posted? Because I'd be happy to answer those questions now.
No, we haven't any questions.
No questions, all right. I guess
because you are explaining all the topics very well.
Well, I'm very happy for that. Or I'm guessing that it's a beautiful sunny day in Athens today or somewhere in Greece and people are enjoying the beach more than a user group presentation. Is that a possibility today? Is it a good weather day in Greece?
Yes, we have 40 degrees.
I missed that. It's a good weather day or not a good weather day?
For me, it's very good.
Well, it's winter down here in Melbourne, Australia, right? So it's like we're not going to the beach, I can tell you. All right, well, look, let me bring this to a conclusion then. And the conclusion is very straightforward. First of all, if you want to watch this recording, and Antonios, I saw that you have recorded it, but Chris and I recorded it as well, and it's available for watching at Microsoft. So I'll give you the link in a minute to download this presentation, but you can click and then you can register to watch the webinar with Chris Webb and I presenting this same presentation. Now, there's also excellent documentation at Microsoft, so it's kept up to date, and the guidance documentation is particularly excellent, I can tell you, because I'm one of the main contributors. So if you're looking for any guidance on direct query or import modeling or star schema, then check out the guidance documentation at Microsoft. Actually, you know, I'm curious to know if I open this up and if I switch this to not English US, but I'm going to guess is it GRGR? What's Greek?
el.gr. el-gr.
What is it?
el-gr.
EL. Does this translate into Greek? There you go. Does that say Power BI guidance or what? Does this say anything about star schema? It does. All right. So all that I've been talking to you about star schema and the importance of dimension tables and fact tables, measures, surrogate keys, junk dimensions is all here. So do check out the comprehensive documentation teaching you how to optimize your Power BI. All right, so other resources, I know this isn't so practical. I am a trainer in Power BI. I do a lot of training and consulting. And of course, with lockdowns, and in Australia, we're forbidden to travel, by the way. We cannot leave the country without very good reason. So my business model now is virtual training. But if there's interest in training, please let me know. I do not train on an individual basis. I train on a group basis. So if your company has a group of people that would like training, do let me know. Otherwise, we've arrived at the final slide for the presentation, and you are welcome to use the QR code, or what I'm going to do is copy into the chat window various links. Okay, so first of all, the main link will be that you can download this presentation as a PDF, and it includes all of those details. I will also put a link in there for other related content like star schema, RealTime, and the video recording of the presentation with Chris Webb. So on that note, Antonios, if there are no questions, then my job here is done.
Just a moment. Okay, can you hear me? Can you see me? Yes, I would like to thank you. Your presentation, as always, is very interesting. And I would like to thank you all the participants. Please follow us in our social media. Also join us at on our user group in Facebook and LinkedIn, and stay tuned with SQLschool.gr, because we have today we have another presentation about Azure SQL Database Launcher with the presenter is the person who made this feature, is Panagiotis Adamopoulos. So, Peter, I would like to thank you. Also, I would like to thank you all the participants, and I hope to see you in the next and the future SQL Nights. Goodbye.
Thank you, and good night, everybody.
Good night, Peter. Thank you very much.